Marvel's Midnight Suns is a tactical RPG developed by Firaxis Games, and more specifically, the team responsible for XCOM Enemy Unknown and XCOM 2. You probably know by now that cards and deck building are going to be at the center of this game's combat system, but I need to stress from the start that this is not Slay the Spire or Monster Train. Midnight Suns incorporates deck building into a much larger framework, both on the combat map and beyond. If you take one thing away from this video, I hope it's an understanding that this game is no more a clone of Slay the Spire than it is of XCOM. It is new. It is different. It is its own thing. You may like that thing, you may not. After spending 4 hours with it, I found that I did enjoy it, but my goal today isn't to convince you in either direction. It is quite simply to give you enough information to judge the combat system for what it actually is, rather than any preconceptions or surface impressions you may have formed so far. We'll cover the basic rules of combat, then show you a full turn from start to finish so you can see how it flows, go over yet more options available in combat, and how all of this comes together. And finally, we'll share the developer's logic behind using cards in the first place. And if that sounds interesting to you, then let's get to it. All right, let's start with breaking down the basics that we see on screen. At the beginning of each turn, you're going to draw your cards, and it's typically a hand of 6. If you look to the right of the cards, you'll see that there are 3 card plays available for this turn. Also allowed to redraw any 2 cards from your hand to replace, any undesirable cards you may have. There is no end of turn discard, so think ahead and don't keep anything in your hand that you won't use by next turn at the latest. Finally, you can see that we get 1 move each turn. Use move to reposition a hero and set up knockback angles, area of effect attacks, or environment attacks. One nice feature is that if you move and realize that you didn't get it quite right, you can reposition that same hero again as many times as you need, as long as you don't use an ability on a hero. By the way, this should be super obvious, but you can also see your hero's health in the bottom left area of the screen, as well as their experience level. You can also see the mission objectives in the upper left. Okay, stay with me because we're just getting warmed up. Let's talk about the 3 basic categories of cards. First up are attacks. You can tell them by the crossed swords symbol in the upper left of the card. I'm sure that you never would have guessed it, but they will damage 1 or more of your enemies. A little lower on the left-hand side, you'll see the number that tells you how much damage it deals. This is a very basic attack, so it only does 6. Each attack will also provide you with a single point of heroism. In case you forget, you can see it in the bottom left of the card. I know we haven't talked about heroism yet, but remember it because it's really important. And not to be underestimated, a lot of attacks also have secondary effects. This one has knockback. Others can have stun, quick, and a veritable plethora of other goodies. Now, I'll talk more about those in a bit, but let me just say they can have a huge impact on the battle. Next up, we have skills, and you can tell them by the shield icon in the upper left corner. Skills offer supplemental effects like healing, buffs, extra cards, and so on. They don't usually deal damage, but they do provide more heroism than attacks. It's not universally true, but pretty much all the ones that I saw in the early game generated 2 heroism each compared to the 1 for attacks. Even after playing for a good while, I still found myself trying to work out the trade-off of when to use one of my precious 3 card plays for an effect that didn't do any damage, but the heroism is often needed pretty badly, and some of these effects are really strong in their own right. Now, finally, there are heroic cards, and if you've been paying attention, then you may have guessed that this is how you spend heroism, and you'd be right. You can immediately recognize heroics because they have this little orange circle in the upper left. It's the same style that the first 2 types had when showing how much heroism you were generating, but this one is showing how much you need to spend in order to use the card. Heroic cards have significantly more powerful effects, of course, than the basic attacks and skills. The attacks usually hit for more damage as well as hit multiple targets, but the disadvantage of these is that you need to build up your heroism to make it happen. If you get stuck with a handful of heroics and no heroism in the bank, you have a dead hand. You'll see that the damage this card deals is in the same spot on the left as we saw with basic attacks. As you can see, the damage this card deals is in the same spot on the left as we saw with basic attacks. And the added effect of knockback is in the same place we saw it on the other cards. It's all pretty easy to suss out even without a tutorial. There's actually more to combat, even in terms of what the heroes can do, but we'll come back to that in a bit. For now, let's shift to your enemies because there are a few basics you need to know about them as well. So first, notice how some of them have little red health bars over their heads. Those are elites, and the others are called minions. Now, minions have literally no health, and any damage at all will KO them. Obviously, the elites have as much health as their health bar says they do, and you will have to chip away at them to get them down. We'll get more into how to use this distinction between the two types in just a second. One other thing I want to draw your attention to is that above their heads, you'll also see a little icon representing one of the heroes. This is telling you who they plan to attack on their next turn. Now, this is really important intel. In this case, almost all of them are planning to attack Captain Marvel, and it looks like only 1 or 2 attacks are going to Blade and the Huntress. Now, this can lead to one of your heroes getting knocked out, and you do want to avoid that. So either use an ability to protect the hero that they're focusing on, if you have any protective abilities, or aggressively target several of the ones that are focusing on that one hero. The hunter can easily survive one attack, but even the strongest of your characters is going to go down if you just let the enemies hammer away with their whole group. One last thing, there are enemy reinforcements almost every turn for at least a couple of turns to keep the pressure on you. Okay, I know this is a lot to absorb, but when you play the game, the first few combat missions are all set up to teach you this gradually. But now what we're going to do is start talking through a turn in motion so you can actually see some of this in practice rather than just talking about it in abstract. Now, this mission was a little different as we had to take out a helicopter in a limited number of turns while also defeating a bunch of Hydra agents. This is still one of the earlier and simpler missions, but it should give you a good look at how a basic turn flows. We start off with an attack from the hunter to build up a bit of heroism and get some damage in. Now, this attack has the quick ability, which means that if the attack KOs an enemy, then your card play gets refunded, so we still have 3 more plays. It also had knockback, and I was able to knock a minion into an elite. So we got the KO we needed on the dweeb and started chipping away at the elite. Being able to set up and even stack action efficiencies like this is really powerful. Next up, we take a look at a heroic ability from Captain Marvel, but the Huntress is in the line of fire and I wasn't certain whether she'd take damage or not. So we scoot her out of the way using our free move for the turn before unleashing the power of the photon beam to KO 2 Hydra goons and get some damage in against that copter. At this point, I wanted to get some heroism built up, and I was also looking for some attack cards that didn't need heroism to play. So I used one step ahead to try to reload. This ended up being a great move because I drew a card that allowed Captain Marvel to go into what's called binary mode. This thing is insanely good. It gives her the ability to block a bunch of incoming damage. It amps up the damage she deals and doesn't even cost a card play. So I carefully considered my option for about 2 seconds and then used it. For my final card play of the turn though, I KO'd 1 more Hydra minion to cut down on the incoming damage, but I'm actually not sure that was the right move. I felt like I had a lot of time to take out the helicopter, but I probably should have focused more on that primary objective while I had the chance. I also should have used a redraw on one of her Fists of Radiance because there was no way I could use both on the next turn, and I didn't really have much of anything else in my hand that was going to help me finish the fight. I had a decently productive turn, but I didn't do a good job of setting myself up to be successful on the next. So finally, you see the enemy got a few attacks in, although none of them were especially painful, and then the inevitable reinforcements arrive. Hopefully this is all starting to come together for you, but there is more to the combat system, and I have to admit that I never fully incorporated a lot of this into my play as I worked my way through this session. But let's get into some of the other options, and we'll talk about my shortcomings later. On the hero side of the fence, environmental attacks are almost always available and can take on a variety of forms. It should be obvious when one is available because the objects glow when they can be used to attack a nearby enemy. The most basic example is to pick up a small object and throw it at an enemy. It's also possible to push larger objects so that they go flying and damage everyone in their path. One really important thing to keep in mind about these attacks is that they don't use up a card play, but they do use 1 point of heroism. This was a constant rub for me because the heroic cards are so good that you don't want to take away from your ability to use them, and yet these can also be very useful. Heroes also have a chance to get critical attacks. You have a chance every time you draw a card for it to be a crit, so you'll know before you use it that it will do more damage. Each hero has their own crit chance stat, and that will determine the odds of drawing a crit. They also have a crit damage stat, and that tells you the percentage of extra damage each crit will do. In the early game, I didn't really see this come into play much, but I'm pretty certain that it will be possible to turn at least some heroes into crit monsters by the end of the campaign. I hope so anyway. One area that we've already talked about that I want to expand on a bit are the effects that cards have. Even in the relatively short time I had with the game, there were a lot of them. And I have no doubt that there are many more introduced as the game progresses. You've seen knockback, but there's a more forceful version of that that pushes enemies back farther, and that comes in handy more often than you would think. Weak makes someone deal less damage. Vulnerable makes them take more damage. You can stun someone so they can't act. Strengthen makes you deal more damage. Fast reduces your heroism casting costs. And these are just a few examples. What really makes all these work, though, is the way each one is only applied to an ability or a hero where it makes sense. So you won't see Dr. Strange punching someone and knocking them back, but you will see him cast the Winds of Watum spell and that pushing them back, which just feels right. Some abilities are pretty specific to one hero. So for example, Ghost Rider can drain souls and has a whole system of abilities built around that. Blade incorporates bleed, chain, and lifesteal. And all of that feels really thematic for a vampire and also kicks pretty serious butt if you can chain it all together. I wish I had a video of me putting all of these pieces together into devastating combos so you could see the system in all its glory. But the reality is that I was very much still in the early stages of piecing all this together and learning what each hero was capable of. And I wasn't nearly as effective in combat as I might have been. There's one more specific aspect of combat I want to cover before we move on, and that has to do with the enemies. Just as we get specific effects, so do they. Some of these are the exact same that we get access to, but some are unique. Venom, for instance, has something called Symbiote Skin that lets him immobilize any of your heroes that use melee attacks against him. I also played a mission where he throws objects down onto the battlefield from above, and you need to clear your heroes out of the area before the end of your turn or eat a bunch of damage. So you can use a melee attack to get out of that area of effect, or your free move, or anything else you can think of. Even better, you can knock enemies into the area and they'll take the damage that was meant for you. I've talked about a lot of different mechanisms and illustrated them as best I could, but let me try to explain what I appreciate about all of this. Taken on their own, there are a lot of cool abilities and they do a great job of bringing these heroes to life. But that doesn't really make a great tactical game, does it? What I fell in love with in this combat system is the need to juggle and keep track of all the different aspects and make tough choices. Should I give up a precious point of heroism on an environmental attack or save it for a heroic card? Can I spare a card play to use a heal or buff ability? Or am I so desperate for damage that I feel like I need all 3 card plays just to thin the enemy herd? Should I redraw to pitch a great heroic card that I can't use yet to make room for something that's good right now? And maybe the most basic but most important point of all, am I using one play to get maximum value from the next and then the one after that? Am I using the right abilities in the right order? Because you get a lot more value that way than you will if you only focus on one thing at a time. And that leads me to the next thing I'd like to talk about, which is to put the whole decision to build the combat in this game around deck building into context. When I attended the event where I was allowed to play Midnight Suns, there was also a presentation by the creative lead, Jake Solomon, where he talked about the game, and one section was especially interesting. He described all tactical games as puzzles once you boil them down. And he believes that these puzzles that are presented to the player each turn needs to be interesting, they need to be challenging, that they have to be almost endlessly playable. And in his opinion, those puzzles require a random factor to keep them tactically interesting. When this same team was designing XCOM, the source of the randomness was whether the abilities would succeed. So you could miss shots, fail to hack a robotic enemy, and so on. But as soon as they started working on Midnight Suns, they saw that they couldn't do the same thing because it just didn't fit the Marvel superhero fantasy. You aren't going to see Captain Marvel hide behind cover, and she's also not likely to miss when she tries to punch someone. So for Midnight Suns, they came up with a new way to introduce a random factor that the player has to deal with. Each card exists to represent an ability that the hero has. And from turn to turn, you won't know which abilities you have access to. So the puzzle, your puzzle, will change every turn, every mission, every campaign. Part of your challenge is to take the hand you're dealt and make it work. Now, if you don't enjoy a random factor or don't enjoy the idea of cards, I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong. But I did want to share his thoughts with you because if nothing else, it helps show the intent behind the game design. And I, for one, think he made some pretty good points. It's funny, I've spent almost 20 minutes talking about combat in Midnight Suns, and I still feel like there's more that deserves to be mentioned. There are certainly more effects that we didn't cover, and I especially wish that I had been in more than 1 or 2 battles with any one character, so I could have mastered their abilities better and captured the kind of eye-popping moments that I can see are possible in this game. Even after 4 hours of playing, I was still wrapping my mind around some of the systems and how they interact with each other. I was constantly thinking of things I should have done differently and wanted to play more so I could do better. Meanwhile, each combat mission still had tutorial type material to introduce new mechanisms and give me still more to factor into the equation. I don't want to overstate this and make it sound like a super complex game that only an elite few will understand. There is meat on these bones, especially the way the 3D environment opens up a whole new raft of options and demands that traditional 2D deck builders don't have. But if you're willing to put forth the effort to learn the fundamentals through the early missions, then I don't think most people will find the challenge level to be unreasonable. In the end, I hope I was able to explain enough and show enough video to give you a decent view of the early game combat. In addition to the one turn that I talked you through, I've also included a lot of footage from the fight when Spider-Man joins the team. And if you watch closely, you'll see that it both includes a lot of the things that I've described and introduced still more that was new. And that really is the key. I'm hoping that in addition to all my blather, I've shown you enough to get an idea of whether this is a combat system that interests you. Let me know in the comments if I left something out that you would particularly like to know. And if you're interested in more than the combat that Midnight Suns offers, then you might want to check out the video I made covering what it's like to play the game in total. There's an awful lot to it besides these battles, and I distilled my thoughts on the whole package down to a manageable length for your viewing pleasure. Either way, that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.